Yum, yum!
Greg here from Pixel Fondue, and in this video we're going to take a look at the Texture Falloff Node in MODO 10.2 V1. V1, people, that is one gigantically long naming scheme for MODO there. So what is this weird blue and gold thing? It is a little piece of geometry I made with just 3 MeshOps. There is a cube MeshOp, a thicken MeshOp, and a Polygon Bevel MeshOp. That's it. So how, you may ask, did we get this wave motion? How did we get this golden grid on top? And if you look really closely, this golden grid, actually these bevels, as they get higher up, the bevels extend. And as they get lower down in the trough, the bevels go down. So how did we get this complex motion and this cool selection on this just simple piece of geometry with just 3 MeshOps? And we did it all with the Texture Falloff Node, one of my favorite new nodes in MODO. Moving on, let's see how we did it. So right off the bat here, I have my wave mesh right there. And I have 3 mesh operations. I have a cube mesh op, a thicken mesh op, and a polygon bevel mesh operation. You'll notice that I'm also keeping the schematic open here, and I'm in the setup tab. I'm in the setup tab because I have the timeline here. I could add a timeline to the modeling tab if I want to, but you can do anything procedural in the setup tab as well, or any tab with the mesh operations tab in it. Any layout, I should say, with the mesh operations tab in it. And if the layout doesn't have a mesh operations tab, you can of course add a mesh operations tab. So you can get to it, mesh operations in any layout really. But I want to talk about the schematic and the mesh operation pane a little bit. So there are really just 2 ways of viewing the same data. So all these nodes in here are the same ones. If I sort of twirl down these guys here, they're the same nodes that you see here. So all of these nodes here, all these mesh operations and these sort of sub operations, these selection and fall off operations that I see here in the mesh operations pane are also here, if I select them all, in the schematic view. It's just 2 ways of viewing the same data really. And what we have in the mesh operation pane is an order of operations. That's one of the main, there's 2 main advantages really in the mesh operation pane. One, we see an order of operations, bottom to top, bottoms first, cube first, then thicken, then polygon bevel. Same with selections, this polygon selection first, this polygon selection second. Same with the shader tree really. Any list in MODO like this is always, any list like this is always evaluated from the bottom up. So the shader tree is evaluated from the bottom up, the base and the materials evaluated first, and then the shader. And the same thing with the mesh operation pane, bottom up. Now the deal with the schematic is it doesn't show flow, so to speak. It just shows connections. So it's showing that my wave mesh is communicating with these 3 different mesh operations here, right? It's communicating with cube, it's communicating with thicken, it's communicating with bevel. Now I've arranged these similar to the mesh operation pane with cube on the bottom, thicken in the middle, bevel on top. But it could be anywhere, right? I just do this because it makes more sense to me. But I'm not viewing any sort of order of operations at all in the schematic. All I'm viewing is connections, right? These purple lines are relationship connections. I can hide them. But when I show them, it's just showing who's talking to who. So this wave mesh item is talking to these 3 operators here. This polygon bevel operator is also talking to a selection operator, and is also talking to a fall off operator. And the thicken is also talking to a fall off operator, texture fall off operator, which is talking to a texture right here in the texture slot. And you can see that up here as well. So if I look at thicken and I look at tool pipe, and there's the texture fall off, and there's the texture right there. So I can look at it this way. Texture, right? Fall off, right? Operator, right? Whoops. Operator, right? So 2 ways to look at the same thing. The other thing I can do in the mesh operation pane, though, that I cannot do in the schematic, one is being able to reorder, do the order of operations. The other thing I can do over here is mute different operators. So I could turn off the eyeball, and I'm basically turning that operator off. I'm not deleting it, I'm just disabling it. And I cannot do that in the schematic. In fact, you'll notice that there's no indication on this visual indication that it's inactive. So the only indication we have it's inactive is over here. And there's no indication of order over here. The only indication of order, say I swap thicken with polygon bevel, I get a completely different looking mesh over here, right? Nothing changed over here because I cannot see order of operations in the schematic. I can only see connections. Let me put this back up top. So it's a common misconception. So In the schematic, you can absolutely see order of operations with channel connections. So if I were to add like a couple math nodes here, like an add node and a multiply node, multiply, basic math, multiply. Here I'm just connecting, there's a plus and a multiply, right? I'm just connecting channels. You'll notice that that is not purple, that's sort of a whitish blue color. That is a channel. If I hide that channel right there, you'll see that is hidden. If I hover over that, you'll see that says show channel connections. Channel connections are from A to B, right? That is showing flow. We're out of this one into this one. But that's not the same thing with the purple guys. These are just showing who's communicating these relationship connections, all right? Glad we cleared that up. So see connections here, see order here, and also mute things here, right? So I'm going to actually mute a couple of these guys just to show you how this is built up. First thing we have is just a cube. And the cube has a 0 size on Y, so now it's a plane. If I put this back to 1, it's a cube, right? And so this is sort of how it started. And I put this down to 0, and now I have a plane. And I've got 40 segments in Y and Z. So if I had those 1 and 1, it's just one big polygon, but I had it 40 and 40, okay? And the next thing I did was add a thicken operation there. So you'll notice this thicken operator, it seems to be attenuated by some sort of curve. And if I look at my thicken right here, I'll notice that in the tool pipe I have a connection there, a texture fall off, which is connected to a gradient. If I disconnect that, you'll see that the thicken just goes right up 100 millimeters like I have here. But when I reconnect it, magic happens, and the thicken has been attenuated by the texture fall off. So this is where the really interesting stuff happens. In fact, I'm going to, I think, just build this guy from scratch. Let me turn that bevel back on so you can see how this works from scratch instead of me just deconstructing it. That may be a better way to do this. So let me do that. And I think we've discussed enough about the schematic here and the pane. And one of the things I like having about the schematic open is what I just did, just disconnecting those fall off here. It's very easy to disconnect operators and reconnect them in the schematic. So I can do that over here as well in the tool pipe. So if my thicken, I have my texture fall off, I can disconnect it by pressing this X here. If I press it, it's going to disconnect. You see that purple line disappear? And I can add it back by going to existing and hunting it down over here. But see, now I can't remember which one it is. I have to look down here at texture fall off too. And reconnect it. So you can do disconnection and reconnection here in the operator pane. It's just easier to do it. You see that popped back into place. It's just easier to do it in the schematic. So schematic is useful for disconnecting and reconnecting and making sort of these communication line connections. And it's useful for sort of seeing how it's all laid out, who's talking to who. Maybe easier than a list sometime because you have to twirl all these guys down. Not that easy all the time. So that's the difference between schematic and the mesh operation pane here, this sort of list. And okay, so great. I'm going to move on here, and we're going to recreate the wave, which is animatable, from scratch. So let's move this wave over this away and recreate it from scratch. I'm actually going to go to my item list here. Actually, I can pop that down, go to my item list and hide it. And I think I'm going to put this texture fall off in this fall off group there. And I'm going to hide those two. Okay, so let's start from scratch in the model pane and create that weird shape. So let's create a new empty mesh. I can do that by pressing N like this. Oops, I'm putting it inside my fall off folder there. Let me pull it out. And I'm going to delete that and show you that again. You can press the letter N for a new empty mesh. All right, great. We've got that. I'm going to delete that. You can also go add item and just press M, and there's my mesh, and do it that way. So there's a couple ways to add a new empty mesh. And I'm going to rename this, let's call it Wave B. Easy enough. And let me twirl that back down, and let's get started here. So I'm going over to the mesh operation pane. And I've sort of squeezed this MODO UI down so it fits into the screen cap area, but normally you'd have a little more room. And one of the things I like to do is see this nice little handy dandy bar here that they put in between the item list, stacked item list, and mesh operator pane in MODO 10.2. Press that arrow and it maximizes the operator list. I actually like to do that. I like to work with it maximized because I have no problem going over here to the item tab. I don't need to have it stacked like this. I just prefer the entire pane to be the mesh operator pane. So All right, first thing we're gonna do, add a cube, C-U-B-E, trying to type around a microphone. And there's my cube. Let's make that 0 meters on Y, so now it's a plane. And let's bump up the segments to 40 on X and 40 on Z. And I'm just gonna Control 1 to bring up my toggle pie menu. If you're not a Control 1 person, get used to Control 1. Commit that to your muscle memory because it's a great little pie menu to toggle stuff on and off. So I just toggled off my grid, and there is my procedural plane with 40 segments and X and Z. And moving on, let's add a thicken operator. So THCKEN, thicker, thicken, whatever. And then I'm going to bump that up 0.2. So now we have that thicken there. In fact, maybe I'll just do 0.1. And so there we have the thickened plane, right? Pretty dull. But now let's get into the interesting stuff here. Twirl this down and go to the tool pipe drop down, and we're going to insert a fall off into the tool pipe. So add tool pipe, and here we're defaulting to existing, I think because I had shown that before, but let's go to new. And what's cool about doing this here instead of the schematic is this will auto filter the list for you, right? So all of these things can fit into the tool pipe slot. And I want to pick Texture Falloff, that new Falloff you see there with the little Mona Lisa. And there we go. Texture Falloff is in. Keep twirling, and we can pick a texture now. So add texture. And again, MODO just sort of auto filters everything out, so you can pick whatever texture you want. And I always look for the gradient, which is handy dandy blue and red, so you can't miss it. And now I've got a gradient in there. So we're going to use a gradient texture to modulate the thicken falloff. So this is different. The thicken operator. So a fall off is different than a selection, right? So the selection slot is here on the thicken operator, but the fall off is going to essentially modulate the effect of thicken, whereas the selection will just pick the polygons that the thicken will be applied to. So there's a difference between a fall off and a selection. Fall off attenuates the effect of the mesh operator, where the selection just tells the mesh operator which elements to be applied to. And of course, you can combine the two as well. So the gradient, we're going to go over here to input parameter. It defaults to back facing, which is fine if you're doing some shading, but we're not shading. We're going to do something different. We're actually going to go down to sample parameters and X distance to locator. I think that might be popping off the screen a little bit, but that's X distance to locator. Bring that up. And then I'm going to click Edit Gradient to bring in my gradient editor right there. And what this is doing, X distance to locator, is going to measure the distance to the texture locator, the gradient texture locator. And so one of the issues here is we don't see the gradient texture locator. It's not visible in this mesh operation pane. It's hidden. So I need to go over here to the shading tab, or I could go to the schematic. And this is the gradient, right? I have it selected, right? Whoops, that's collapsed now. This gradient right there. And so I can actually scroll down the plus in the little nodes list here and get to the gradient texture locator that way, or I could have just kind of grabbed it in the viewport. I just want to make sure that texture locators are visible though. So Control 1, remember our toggles, toggle texture locators. Now they're on. So I actually don't want to see some of these old ones here. So let me hide those guys. In fact, let me just kind of get a few of these out of the way. Boom, boom, boom. Do a little cleanup here. So we had moved our original wave over there. So let's move these texture locators that are with that original item over there. Bye-bye. So they're kind of out of the way. And let's hide that first guy. But we're going to be dealing with this one, which is our new gradient that we're going to be using to attenuate the thicken effect here. So let's move it to the edge. Dunk, 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 dunk. Like go like this. And if you aren't sure what the here we're moving it over like minus 0.5, right? I know how big this is. It's if I go to my MeshOp tab here and look at my cube, I know that it's, you know, a meter in X, so 0.5 meters, negative 0.5 puts it on the edge. Another thing I can do is just enable under display, I can enable dimensions here. I can add dimensions. You go to Dimensions tab, and I can set that to on. So even if I don't have the wave selected, if I can roll over it, I can see the dimensions there. See the dimensions are popping up, 1 meter. And how high is it? 0.1. So that can be helpful sometimes, having dimensions viewable in the viewport. And what I'm going to do now is I've got my locator here. on the edge of my thickened plane. And let's go to my MeshOps, my thickened MeshOp, tool pipe, texture fall off textures right there. There's my gradient. And it's set to X distance to locator. So this is the locator. We're going to be making a gradient in terms of the distance from this locator. So if I go to the value here, right now it's 100%. So if we're 0 meters away from this locator or anything else, we're at 100% value. But if I make one at, say, 1 meter, which will be on the other side here, 1 meter away. So make a middle mouse click, and we'll set this to 1 meter. And hit A to auto-fit it. And I can click a middle mouse, click another one, and we'll put this one at 0.5 meters. And they're also at 100%, so nothing's going on. The thicken is being applied at 100% on this polygon plane. But if I grab this middle keyframe here, which is halfway in between this side and this side, it's 0.5 meters away from this locator, I can move that effect down. You'll see that thicken effect coming down here. So if I sort of zoom out a little bit and get all the way down to like 3%, you can see what I'm doing there, right? So it's a pretty cool effect. I can go in, I can add a couple more keyframes if I want, and I can even push it over 100% if I want to get sort of a wavy effect. But what I have now with the texture fall off applied as a texture fall off node applied as a fall off to this thicken mesh operation is a very precise way of controlling that thicken mesh op and where I want it. And here I'm just using a distance, X distance from this locator as a way to control it. But there's you can rig it however you want. That's just how I've decided to rig it in this case. So let me delete those guys. And of course you can animate it. So I can grab this guy here and I can, if I move it, of course it changes the distance to the locator. So I'm animating that wave effect, right? Look familiar? Okay, so we're kind of halfway there. In fact, I'm going to turn this guy, go back to minus 0.5. And so there's a couple things I can do here if I want to animate it. Right now, I'm in the model tab, so there's no time here. So I can do a couple of things. I can add a time bar to the bottom here, or I could just go to a tab that has a time bar along the bottom. So either one's fine. I'm just going to run over to the setup tab real quick because it has a time bar on the bottom already. I just want to make sure my texture locators are viewable. So again, if you press O, you can turn them on here under visibility, show texture locators, there they are. Or if I have them off, I can also remember my control 1 toggles that you're going to commit to muscle memory. There they are again. There's my texture locators. So if I go back to frame 0 and I say I'm going to set a keyframe on Y, just select, X, position X, press S in item mode. I've set a keyframe there. Let's go to maybe frame 50 and put this on the other side, 0.5, automatically set a keyframe there because I have auto keyframe active. And if I want to, I can bring up my graph editor somewhere. Where's my graph editor? I believe F7, but I can also click down there. And let's make this linear. Why not? So we've got a linear motion here, and then I'm going to get this last keyframe. Let me just make this a little bigger for you. And I'm going to go down here to the end behavior and select repeat. So now I have that texture locator moving and repeating, and I'm getting that wave effect. Pretty sweet. It's hard to believe that's just a thicken mesh op. That sort of cool deformation effect. But that's all it is. It's a thicken mesh operator with a texture fall off gradient on that. So that's pretty cool. So we got a good start here. Let's go back to the model layout now that we have that animation thing taken care of. And I'm actually going to toggle off my texture locators because I don't really need to see them now. Press Q to drop the move tool. And let's keep adding to this. We need to add a bevel operation on top of this as well. So add operator and poly bevel. Whoops. Poo, not poo, P-O, poly bevel. Or the poo mesh op. That's a new one in 10.2, the poo mesh op. Okay, so poly bevel. Right now, what this is going to do is just bevel everything. And we do not want to bevel everything. We only want to bevel these polygons on the top. So the first thing I'm going to do is do a selection operation here. So we're going to do add selection. And I'm going to add a selection operator polygon. Now here's where I'm going to do a little bit of rigging. You see all this went away because right now nothing is selected. So I'm going to hit basic over there because I don't like that tab. I'm going to hold down control and slash down on that little dot there. And I split my viewport, right? And I'm going to turn this bottom one into a schematic. Go down to utility and schematic. Now I've got a schematic, and I'm going to grab wave B here and drop it in. I'm going to hit A to sort of, Shift A to push in on it and frame it. Double click my little yellow diamond there, and I can see all my MeshOps. Now, again, these didn't come in order. Remember, bottom up, cube, thicken, polybevel, right? That's how these are being evaluated. But evaluation doesn't mean anything. Order of evaluation doesn't mean anything in the schematic. It's just showing connections. So here, it's kind of shown them really backwards of what I'd want. I'd really want this cube to be on the bottom and the polybevel on top and a thicken in the middle just to make it easier on my brain, right? So now I can sort of match these two up, cube, thicken, polybevel, even though that doesn't do anything to the actual order of operations. That's only handled over here. All right, so I'm going to double click on my selection mesh operation, and there's my polygon selection mesh op, right? And all it's doing now is sitting there doing nothing because it's selecting nothing. So this is a bit of a powerful node. And what I'm going to do is look in the channels here. I've got a number of channels in this. I don't need the workplace selected, so groups. I'll deselect that. I've got a number of channels over here in this little node. I'm going to drag over the normal Y channel. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that thing where I right click on that normal Y channel and I say separate channel. And I just like to do that to make it a little bit easier on the eye. So I can, again, now this is not a relationship purple connection. This is a channel connection. So this does show flow. These white channel connections do show flow. I'm going to flow from here to here. I'm going to put this normal Y channel into this selection channel. What that's going to do is going to go through, it's going to loop through every single polygon in this mesh. This little operator right here is going to loop through every single polygon. It's going to look and see if it has a normal facing in the Y direction. And if it does, it's going to select it. So I match that up and you'll see now all of those guys are beveled here. So if I pull this out, none of them are beveled. And if I connect it, they're all beveled. So that's a polygon selection operator right there. So that's not everything I want though. I also want to get that sort of plus pattern, that cross pattern on the top. So I'm going to add another selection operator. So go to add selection operator, and this time I'm going to select by fall off. So select by fall off. Before that, I do that, let me just show one thing. Just sort of rip this off here. You see these aliases here. We have channel modifier aliases, and selection operator aliases. And there's all these cool selection operations in here, like select by triangles, and select by part, and select by volume, and select by distance, and select by curve. You may be asking yourself, why are they not in this selection operator list over here? And why are they in this alias list, and what's an alias? An alias is a new feature in MODO 10.2. And I think the Foundry has done some videos regarding them. But let me just go over really quickly because these are important. All of these selection operators here in the new slot or new directory are sort of hard-coded, coded in C by the Foundry developers, right? So all of these little nodes here are hard-coded in C. Over here, these aliases, these selection operators here, these are actually made with these nodes and additional nodes. So if I were to I'm going to go down here and add one real quick, actually. So let me go to my thicken selection here. I'm going to select my, I'm going to select my little selection channel here on my thicken MeshOp node. I'm going to go to add. I'm going to add that select random mesh operator there, and you'll see it turned yellow. And you also see that I'm now randomly thickening things. And then I'm just going to disconnect that because we don't need it. But I want to show you what this is. So this is, like I said, these aliases are created with nodes. They're not coded in C like the other ones, but they're super useful. And you can create them as well and package them up as a single item here. If I right click and say expand to assembly, you'll see it turn into assembly here like that. So that's an assembly. And if you know anything about assemblies, you know you can double click them to get inside. You can see what this is now. So this select by random selection operation is just, it's a number of different nodes all hooked together here by one of the developers at the Foundry, but it could be you or a user, and then it's collapsed into its own sort of single item that can be added via the preset browser. So that's what a selection, those are what those aliases are. The selection aliases and the channel operation aliases and the mesh operation aliases. they're operators composed of nodes that have been collapsed down into one little unit. So, okay, that's a big divergent here. I didn't really want to go there, but I thought they should be mentioned. So I don't need this anymore, so I'm just going to delete that. But back to where we were, we've used this selection operator with the normal Y to bevel just the polygons on top, but I want to add to that. So I can add another selection operation, and this time I'm going to go to select by falloff, and there you see it, select by falloff. And again, keep in mind that these operators are evaluated from the bottom up, just like the selection operators are, bottom up, just like these mesh operators are. So I actually want this one to be evaluated second. So I'm going to drag it above this selection operator here. Let me turn it off for now. You can see that this one right here selects all those polygons on Y. Those are beveled up, or thickened, or no, yeah, beveled up right now. And then my select by fall off, let me turn it on. Again, what it's doing is it's overriding everything underneath it because it's set to override, and there's no actual texture on here yet. So it's not selecting anything. In fact, there's no actual fall off added yet. So we just have the select by fall off selection operator on there. And now I'm going to add a fall off to it. We'll add the texture fall off. And then we're going to add a texture to the texture fall off. So add textures, and we're going to do just like a grid, I think. Grid. You know what I can always do? I can always type grid right here. This grid I like. And then let's, I'm actually going to flip these. So I'm going to invert it. In fact, I don't need to invert it. I'll actually invert it with an operator. That'll be kind of cool to do. So let me change the size here, 0.25, control return. You can see what I'm doing is I'm selecting with a grid here. Instead of solid mode, let's do planar Y. And there we go. We're using grid texture on the texture fall off hooked into a selection operation. So it's a little bit confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this easier on us. I'm going to double click here in the schematic. Again, the schematic is another way to view this data. So that's why I have it open. So it's easier to understand MODO if you understand the schematic and what's going on over here in the mesh operation list. So let's look at our tool pipe here. So we've already have this, we got my gradient. So let's start over, right? So I'm going to turn off a couple things here. Let's turn off everything. We've got our cube, which is now a plane. Then we add our thicken, and that's modulated. This thicken has a texture fall off in the tool pipe, and it's modulated by this gradient. And you can look at it here, texture fall off, texture gradient. And that texture, that gradient texture has a texture locator that's animated. That's what's giving it that wave effect. And we move on to Polygon Bevel. We'll turn it back on here. We are beveling, and we turn off, we'll get my selection operators here. I'm going to turn off the top one. So we're just beveling the polygons facing with a normal facing in Y, which is just the top guys here. Then we're going to add a selection operator on top of that. So we have this select by fall off. Let me enable it. And we're going to set override to multiply. So it's going to take everything that's selected here, all those guys in Y, all those guys selected here, and it's just going to multiply on top of that, just like you'd multiply images together. So where this is 100%, these are 100%, right? And where this is 0%, sort of the in-between things, we get 0% multiplied against this operator below it. So we're only getting these chunks here. And I actually liked to invert that. So there's a couple ways to invert it. I can invert it here by inverting the texture by doing 100 and 0. So now we've got this grid there, the grid lines. But I think I could invert it here as well. Maybe not actually. If I do there is an invert selection operator, so I could add yet another selection operator here. So add another selection operator. Whoops, add a selection, add a selection operator, invert. But this may not be what I want. If I put this at the top, it's going to invert everything below it. Yeah, so it's actually, it's inverting everything. So I'm also beveling out the sides. So I don't really want that. So let's turn off invert, but now you know that exists. So yay, yes, delete it. And we're just going to adjust my grid texture here. Invert that, 100 value for the line and 0 value for the filler, and there we've got it. So the last thing we had, if I bring up the little animation there again, is that bevel got really high when it was high up in Y and got really low in strength and was down in Y. So let's do that. And again, we're going to use a texture fall off. So the brand new texture fall off node we will be using a third time, and we're going to not create a selection with it. We're just going to attenuate this bevel effect with it. So under tool pipe, we can close up selection now because we have all the selections we want. We're going to add texture fall off. Now it's added, but there's no texture yet. So let's twirl down. I'll just expand it here so we can follow along in the schematic. And I could always hook up a texture in the schematic if I want to, but I'm just going to do it over here. Twirl down texture, add texture. And again, we're going to do a gradient, GRAD, and we'll do not an existing, but a new gradient right here. Got a new gradient. And let's change the input of this gradient to sample parameters, Y distance to locator, and then let's edit the gradient. So we know if I hover over this, because I have my dimensions on, that this goes about, what, 130 or so millimeters up. So we want to take my value in Y here, and let's create another keyframe at 0.13. Maybe we'll just do, we'll do 0.14 just to be safe. A, just to put it all in there. And so when it's high at 0.14, we want that polygon bevel to be really high. And when it's low, like way down here, we want that polygon bevel to be low. So if I pull this down, you'll notice that the lower we are, whoops, to zoom out here and pull it down to 0, that the lower we are, that bevel is really low, but the higher we are, the bevel is really high. Right? Pretty cool. I want to make sure my toggle on my texture locators, maybe make sure this guy is at the bottom. It is the bottom here. There's my texture locator for that gradient. So it's distance on Y from this locator right here. Right. Pretty cool. I'm going to expand my selection grid gradient just a little bit, so it's not on the line there. We'll call it 0.3 control return to get through everything there. And there we go. It's pretty cool looking. All right, so we've got polygon bevel. I'm going to actually turn off group polygons there. So we just get the individual polygons and kind of see how that works there. And so really low polygon amount there, really high polygon amount as the higher we get, right? So it's kind of a cool effect. And we're doing this with the texture falloff node. So again, we can take a look at this at the schematic here. And there's my gradient, and here's my texture falloff. And of course, if we want to, we can animate this guy too. It's just, you know, we can invert it like that. We can set that, you can animate that by hand or hook up a channel oscillator node to it. So I hope this tutorial was useful in showing you all the things you can do with the texture falloff node, both as a selection mechanism, so we're selecting these polygons here, and as a modulator of certain mesh operations like thicken and polygon bevel. Any mesh operation that will accept a falloff will accept texture falloff. You can modulate that with sort of a global texture, which is cool. And you should be able to actually, let me just split this here and turn this guy into a preview. Hit go. Of course, you should be able to use that over here in shading. We should be able to use this grid, maybe grid number 2 here. And let's do create an instance and drag this grid up here and change the effect of this grid to, diffuse color. So we can actually use that grid that we're using as a selection operator to texture this as well. Pretty cool. So in fact, if I change this grid, it should reflect in the texturing. If I say change the locator size here, say 0.15, and we've got, so anyway, that's it with texture falloff. Hope that was useful.
Yum, yum!